Hello, and welcome to this short session on lesson planning. Let's begin with what lesson plans are. Now, a lesson plan is a detailed guide for the teacher of the lesson and what's actually taking place. It gives you the step-by-step instruction that outlines the teacher activities for that session and the learner activities for that session. It also outlines what everybody should be accomplishing within that session and how the transfer of learning will be assessed for that particular point. Now, when you create a lesson plan, it involves setting learning outcomes or goals. It also involves developing activities for what you want to accomplish during the session. And it'll also determine for you the resources and materials that you're going to need to deliver the said lesson. Now, why are lesson plans important? Well, they're important for a number of reasons, but it helps you stay on track. So it helps you structure your session or your lesson. It increases your confidence as a teacher or as a trainer. It allows you to know what you're supposed to be doing. It helps learners understand what's expected of them in that session. You can share it with your learners if need be, or purchasers, or whoever has a vested interest in the lesson that you're delivering. It helps other trainers cover you in case of absence. So if you're off sick or you're poorly, basically somebody else can come in and deliver your session so the learners don't miss out by having that particular lesson or training session cancelled. And it also helps you as the trainer or the teacher save time in the future because you can recycle your lesson plans. And although you will have a lesson plan for every single session that you deliver, very often those sessions will be the same in their content and nature. Things will change like the venue or the number of learners, but generally speaking, the content of the learning will stay the same. So you can almost recycle that particular lesson plan. It also will help you develop session plans or lesson plans for other similar courses or training. So you can use part of a bigger course to create a smaller course, or you can use several smaller courses to create a bigger course. And just by putting the lesson plans together, you come up with a bigger scheme of work. And it also helps you plan your differentiated activities. Now, these are the activities that meets all the different learning styles and all the different learning points that an individual may have, because as people we're all different, and because we're all different, we all learn in very different ways. And this is what we mean by differentiated learning. And it's recognizing that everybody learns at a different speed and in a different way. So when we're writing our lesson plans, we need to make sure that when we look at the activities that we're going to involve in that particular piece of learning, that they are differentiated. So that recognises those things that people are different. Also provides us with a record of course content. It provides us with a record of what we've taught, what we're teaching to people. Now, that could be evidence for us for quality assurance procedures or processes. It could be evidence for us for an awarding body, for example. Now, when we actually look at doing the lesson plan itself, there's basically 8 key points that we want to make sure that is covered by that lesson plan. Now, probably the easiest way for most of us to do this is to use a template. Now, different organisations, different companies will have their own lesson plan template that they will like everybody to use, so you've got continuity across the trainers or teachers. But the basic 8 components of a well-written lesson plan are: 1, learning outcomes. Your goals, your objective. What is it you want those learners to be able to do at the end of that session? And how are you going to measure that? Also, we want the details of the group. So different groups will have different needs and they will learn in different ways. Even if we're delivering the same teaching or same lesson to groups, each group will be slightly different. Now, what will pretty much remain the same within each lesson and each thing for you is your timings of that session. So that needs to be on your lesson plan. Your introduction, your assessment component of the lesson itself. Also, we want an overall objective of the session. What is it we're trying to achieve? The teacher activity and the learner activity. So, for example, the objective of this particular section of the lesson could be to introduce myself. The teacher activity within that would be me talking to the group with an introduction of my background on what it is that I'm trying to achieve. The learner activity for that point would be to sit and listen and ask questions if needed. So that takes us on to the final 2 points, which are the resources needed for the session and the assessment activities and methods. So if we look at that introduction, the resources needed is a classroom, a venue, and obviously myself to be able to give the introduction. The assessment activities and the methods is going to be through observation and direct questioning, so questions and answers. So learning outcomes are statements of what the learners, the students, will expect in that particular lesson or session. The statements are focused on what the learner will learn. So by the end of the session, the learner will be able to, rather than the instructor teaching, rather than what am I going to teach today. What we want the learning outcome focused on is what the learner will be able to do by the end of that session. These statements should include a verb, a phrase, an impact in order to, by the end of phrase. What students will do, be able to do, and how they can apply that skills and knowledge. Now, the clue to the level of expectation of knowledge and understanding is in the different verbs that we use in the learning outcomes. So, when we look at the cognitive skills, we have 5 levels. So, starting with knowledge or remembering, then we have comprehension or understanding, and then application or applying the skill that they've been taught or they've learned. Then, if we are looking at something where they need a deeper understanding of something, then we're going to look for an analysis, or they're going to analyze or analyzing a subject so they can truly understand it. Then we'll have evaluation and evaluating a particular subject or a particular learning point. So they'll evaluate what it is that they've learned. And this is the cognitive skill. Then we'll have the synthesis or the creating. So it depends really what cognitive skill we are expecting from people and on what level we expect their understanding to be as to what verb we're going to use within the learning outcome. Examples of those learning outcome verbs for instruction include define, list, recognise, if we want somebody to have that level of remembering. So by the end of the session, the learner will be able to list the key components of. Now, if we need them to understand or comprehension, then we're going to use the verbs like categorise, describe, explain, identify, locate, recognise, sort, because we need them to understand. So the learning outcome will be, by the end of the session, the learner will be able to categorise, describe, whatever it is that we want them to do. Now, when we look at something like applying that knowledge, the learning outcome becomes, by the end of the session, the learner will be able to choose, demonstrate, implement, perform. Then analyse, and we're going to use verbs like analyse, categorise, compare, differentiate. And the learning outcome becomes, by the end of the session, the learner will be able to analyse and categorise the different aspects of. Then we have evaluating. So we're going to use verbs like assess, critique, evaluate, rank, rate. And that's just the doing bit for that. So again, as the others have already been, by the end of the session, the learner will be able to assess, critique, evaluate, rank, rate. And then when we look at creating, by the end of the session, the learner's going to be able to construct, design, formulate, organise, synthesize. So from that, you can see how the learning outcome depends on the verb that we're using and at what level we want somebody else to do something. When we look at these learning outcomes, these goals, we're going to apply the SMART principle to it. So we've all seen this acronym before. We've all used it. But we really need to make sure that when we're writing learning outcomes and goals for training, that we make sure that it's SMART. So it's specific, it's measurable, it's achievable, it's realistic, and it's time bound. Basically, can we assess what it is that we are setting as our learning outcome? Now, we touched a little bit on differentiation at the beginning, but this is about recognising that learners have individual needs and that we plan to meet those needs. And this includes the more able learners, the learners that take a little bit longer, the learners that need additional support. It recognises that the fact that people learn in different ways and at different speeds, and that they're all different and will have those different things within our group. It also looks at the way that people learn. So some learners are visual, some learners are auditory, some learners are kinesthetic. So we look at those sorts of things. Does somebody need to be told something? Does somebody need to do something? Now, just some of the ways that we can look at differentiating stuff can be used in most situations. So within tasks, support, questioning, target setting, expectation, specific needs, feedback, language, resources, culture, and time. But when we look at lesson plans in particular, we just need to really make sure that we recognise that all learners are different and people learn in different ways and at different speeds. Now, this is basically an example of a lesson plan for a first aid subject. So if you look at this, across the top line here, you have the trainer or the teacher's name. You then have the date of the session and the venue. We have the overall topic or subject here, which in this case is first aid control of bleeding. We have the start time and we have the duration. We also have there the number of learners. Now, these things will very often change from session to session or lesson to lesson. But the learning outcomes for this particular one will remain the same. So in this case, the learning outcome is, by the end of the session, learners will be able to identify the different wound types and demonstrate how to control bleeding. Now, within my details of the group here, I've got all learners are different. Some are visual, some are auditory, some are kinesthetic. And as such, I need to apply a variety of communication skills and activities to engage and include the whole group. Now that's my differentiation point. Now if we look here, we've now got the timings for each of the objectives. The first one is 3 minutes, and that's for my introduction. My teacher activities within that are to introduce myself and the subject. The learner activities are to listen and ask questions. The resources I need to deliver my bit are my laptop, projector, and PowerPoint. The assessment methods that I'm going to use to make sure that the learners have completed their activity is observation and Q&A. So you can see how all that ties back together. Now, the rest of the lesson plan for this short session is pretty much the same. So we have 7 minutes here on wound types. So that's my objective, is to describe and introduce wound types. My activity here is to explain and show on PowerPoint the different wound types. The learner activity is to listen and ask questions. And again, the resources needed are laptop, projector, PowerPoint. And again, the assessment is observation and question and answer. And if you just look at each of these points, they follow the same format. So what is it that we're trying to introduce to the learner? What's the teacher doing? So the teacher activities to introduce that point to the learner. And then finally, what is the learner expected to do? What are their activities? And we just break it down all the way through. So the resources are what we need for it, and the assessment activities is how can we assess that the learner has done what they're supposed to be doing within their activities. And that goes all the way through. And that is basically a lesson plan. That's a simple lesson plan. The longer the session, the bigger the lesson plan. The shorter the session, the shorter the lesson plan. It's quite simple. So here within this, we have 2 learning outcomes, and we have 4 points. For a lesson lasting about an hour, I would probably have 4 learning outcomes and about 6 or 7 stages. I would then, for a full day, have maybe 6 or 7 lesson plans within shorter things to make up my scheme of works. But that overall is how we write, how we form a lesson plan. So thank you for taking the time to just go through this with me. Any questions, please be in touch and I will help you out. Thank you.